Hey everyone, welcome back for some more Standard here on MTG Arena. And my goodness, what I am showing you here has taken so much work. If you tuned into my streams after Lorwyn Eclipsed was released, then you know that I was working on Dimir Midrange and I really wasn't making that much headway. I tried so many different builds, changing the cards around, changing the list around, and I wasn't getting results that I was satisfied with. A lot of you who were participating in the stream did offer really good feedback in the chat, and some of you even left comments after the fact, after the stream was over. And man, I very much appreciate all of the feedback that those of you who watched were providing. It was so valuable, and this was a grind. This was the most difficult brew that I have had to figure out yet, and you can just see from these untapped screenshots how many different versions of Dimir Midrange that I have tried since the release of Lorwyn Eclipsed, and just how mediocre the results have been. You know, about a 50% win rate. In fact, I think in total it's just under a 50% win rate. You know, really poor performance here. So I was really frustrated and I needed to take a break from playing for a while. For those of you who are in my Discord, you know that I put out that announcement a little bit ago saying that I need to take a break. But since then, finally, I think I've cracked the code. Look at this performance of this final version. Most of these matches were played in Mythic, but some of them were played at the start of this season after the rank resets, so those are going to be in Platinum. If you have kept up with my channel, then you know that Dimir Midrange is one of my favorite decks, and this is now the 4th video on Dimir Midrange that I am doing. There are very radical differences, radical changes here for me that I had to make for this version of Dimir Midrange to feel like it can compete in the current Standard landscape. The last time I was brewing with Dimir Midrange, that was before the release of Avatar. That was just after the bans. So since then, Standard has changed quite a lot. The format is much faster. I do just in general think Dimir Midrange is not as strong as it used to be. I think it might not be a tier 1 deck anymore, or if it is, it's barely tier 1. It might be like the bottom of the tier 1. And that just shows in the results from recent events. If you look at the SCGs, there was barely any good Dimir Midrange performances. At Worlds, Dimir Midrange barely made a dent in the standings. And even at the recent Pro Tour from this past weekend, there were some Dimir Midrange that did pretty good, but none of them made it into the top 8. There weren't even that many in the top 16. So it pains me a little bit to say it, but this deck just is not that good anymore. All that being said, the deck has definitely picked up some important pieces from Lorwyn Eclipsed. And I don't think the versions of this deck that were being played at the recent Pro Tour really took full advantage of the Lorwyn Eclipsed cards. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. For now, let me discuss my list that you see in front of you. Starting with 1-drops, and we have a new addition from Lorwyn Eclipsed, which is Flitterwing Nuisance. A big thing for me that I was discussing with some of you in the Discord was, is Flitterwing Nuisance better than Spyglass Siren? And I said the only way that I can figure that out is through testing. After the several hours of testing with all these versions of the deck, I can confidently say that the Nuisance is a better 1-drop than the Spyglass Siren. The Spyglass Siren is a little bit better if you have a way to like return it to your hand and then replay it, because then you get a second map token. But as it is, this ability here to pay 3 mana, remove a counter from this creature, and then get an Enduring Curiosity effect where all of your creatures that do damage to a player or planeswalker, by the way, player or planeswalker, you draw a card. It is so good, and it is so worth it, because believe it or not, this is going to sound weird, but there was a little bit of an issue with Dimir Midrange where if you didn't get a Curiosity, or if you got a Kaido at the wrong time, then all of a sudden you weren't drawing that many cards. You might be able to explore with the map token and see something, but think about it. There wasn't really many other ways to look through the deck. Maybe Breacher of the Schism, which I'm going to come back to a little bit later, but if you didn't get a Curiosity, or if you weren't able to get in with a lot of your attackers, or you didn't have a Kaido at the right time, this Nuisance fills that gap. Because what if you don't have a Kaido on turn 3, but you have 2 attackers in the air, right? You have 2 flyers. Okay, now you get to draw 2 cards. Or even a little bit later, you have 3 attackers, but you don't have Enduring Curiosity yet. Okay, pay 3 mana, draw 3 cards, and now you might have a little bit of mana left over to do something else. Now, that being said, it's not drastically better than Spyglass Siren. I would actually say that it's only marginally better than Spyglass Siren, because Spyglass Siren was already awesome. Not to mention that if you ninjutsu the Spyglass Siren and replay it, now you get another map token, right? That's really good. But as it is, just having this extra card draw, maybe you can just play it when you have a good amount of mana and you already have a bunch of attackers. Then you basically pay 4 mana, which is basically Enduring Curiosity, right? And now you get to draw that many cards. So definitely provides more value than the Spyglass Siren, even though Spyglass Siren is still an excellent 1-drop for this deck. 1 copy of Cecil. This might be a little bit surprising, but one thing is that I do think that Cecil is a little bit more of a liability than he used to be because of Requiting Hex. Cecil dies to Requiting Hex, and your opponent might just wait for him to flip and then remove him. So now you've lost 10 life or whatever, 8 life, 6 life, however much life you've lost just from Cecil, but then your opponent just removes him. That is extremely detrimental. However, there are these situations where Cecil is just really good. For one thing, yes, if you do get him to flip into this lifelinker, and there are a few ways in this deck to facilitate that, then that is just awesome. 4/4 lifelinker for 1 mana, that's always been good. But not only that, I've said this in my other deck texts, he is just a fantastic blocker. 1 mana for a 2/3 Death Touch blocker, that is just excellent. Cecil is good both early and later. Later because of Death Touch, early because you might be able to get him for extra damage since he has 2 power, or you might be able to flip him or whatever. Fairy Dream Thief. I have talked about this card in every single iteration of Dimir Midrange that I have done, and people have still not gotten the memo, even with the fairies that have been released in Lorwyn Eclipsed. This card is just good. You get to Surveil when it enters. It's a 1/1 flyer for 1 mana, decent stats for only 1 mana, but then when it dies, you get to exile it from your graveyard, draw a card, and lose 1 life. There are so many situations where I'm getting extra value from this Dream Thief. Maybe I ninjutsu it with Kaido, and then when it enters, I get to Surveil again. Or maybe it's in the graveyard, I pay 3 mana, I draw an extra card, and then on my draw step, I get the thing that I was really looking for, because I went 1 card deeper. The fact that it's a fairy is also very important because it synergizes well with these other pieces of interaction that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. In the first iteration of Dimir Midrange that I showed with Fairy Mastermind, you could do the fairy sub-theme because you had Fairy Dream Thief and Fairy Mastermind. That's already 8 fairies, and then you could play a few more like Fabloom Trick or whatever. So that had a bit of a fairy sub-theme. I'm bringing it back with this one because we've got a lot of fairies from this Lorwyn Eclipsed set, so that increases the value of Fairy Dream Thief for some of those other synergies. It also is a warlock, which means that it doesn't die to shoot the sheriff, but look, it dies to Requiting Hex, it dies towards the tower, and then it gets exiled, and then you can't do the graveyard thing anymore, right? It's not a super powerful 1-drop, but I do think to this day people undervalue this card. Now we get to another new card from Lorwyn Eclipsed, and this is one that was really on my radar. Glamour Gifter. When I first saw this card in the spoilers, I got so excited because I was like, finally, we have a decent 2-drop for Dimir Midrange that can replace Fairy Mastermind. Because Deep Cavern Bat, as good as this card is not an adequate replacement for Fairy Mastermind because you can't use Deep Cavern Bat to ninjutsu in Kaido. I talked about this in my other recent videos. 1/2 flyer for 2 mana, that's already good. 2 toughness is pretty important. And when it enters, choose up to 1 other target creature, and then that creature gets base power and toughness 4/4 and gains all creature types. So you can use this as a combat trick. Now your Fairy Dream Thief is not a 1/1, it's a 4/4. You can use it to get in for more damage, or you can use it defensively. If your opponent attacks, you can use this as a combat trick to block with that creature and then kill your opponent's creature because now that your creature has a base power of 4/4. Really powerful piece of interaction that comes in the form of a 1/2 flyer, which is really good, but there's an added synergy here with the Gifter, and it's with Kaito because of this last little bit of this effect. Gains all creature types. Think about it. What is the synergy here? What is the synergy here between Kaido and Glamour Gifter with the fact that Glamour Gifter, the creature, gains all creature types? So Kaido's plus up. You gain an emblem with ninjas you control get +1/+1. So obviously that buffs Kaido, and that buffs Soulstone Sanctuary, because Soulstone Sanctuary is all creature types. So now Kaido is a ninja, Soulstone is a ninja, but Glamour Gifter makes your creature all creature types. Your creature becomes a ninja. It now benefits from the emblem from Kaido. So if you have an emblem and you target Fairy Dream Thief with this, Fairy Dream Thief isn't a 4/4, it's a 5/5. So you can actually use the Gifter to just close out a game, not only as a combat trick defensively, and if your opponent has a really big creature, you still might be able to kill it or trade with it or whatever because of emblems from Kaido, or you can just use it to just finish a game. Like, can you imagine for a second if you had 2 of these in your hand and you had a couple of emblems from Kaido and you had a couple of flyers? You play both of those, you're swinging for like 12 damage all of a sudden. And if your opponent doesn't block, that's 12 unblocked damage. So because of that last little bit, the gain all creature types with Kaido, this Gifter provides a lot of value. And not only that, you can use it to ninjutsu Kaido early on in the game, because if you flash this in for 2 mana, it might be unblocked, you can ninjutsu Kaido, and then later on in the game, it gets even better because you might have an emblem from Kaido. So it doesn't matter if you're ninjutsuing it and losing it, it might be even more valuable later on in the game. That being said, I thought it would be an easy 4 of in the deck. It's not. I have tried 4 copies of this in so many versions of this deck, it's just not right. Because if you don't have another creature in play, this thing doesn't really do anything. So going down to 3 copies absolutely feels better. It also actually doesn't synergize that well with the Nuisance, because Nuisance has a -1/-1 counter on it. So if you play the Gifter on it and give it base power and toughness 4/4, it's going to be a 3/3 because of the -1/-1 counter. So that's actually a little bit of an asymmetry. If you remove the counter from the Nuisance to draw the cards and everything, then it will be a 4/4. But you can see what I'm saying, right? The Gifter also synergizes with another card, which has been a bit of a classic in Dimir Midrange, which is Deep Cavern Bat. Obviously, look, Deep Cavern Bat has been played in Dimir Midrange ever since rotation happened and Fairy Mastermind was taken away. But the huge asymmetry here with Deep Cavern Bat is that you can't use it to ninjutsu Kaido because you're going to give the thing back that you took. So it was so irksome. It was so annoying for me to play 3 or 4 copies of Deep Cavern Bat, and then that's my only creature, and I can't ninjutsu in Kaido. And so now I have all these other options, right? This is why I was playing so many 1-drops to allow Kaido to be ninjutsued in. But Deep Cavern Bat is still really good as a utility creature. That's why there's 2 copies of it in here, because you can potentially take away, later on in the game, you can take away your opponent's power play, or you can take away a piece of removal or whatever. But there's also really nice synergy here with the Deep Cavern Bat and the Glamour Gifter, because if you're going to swing with all of your 1/1 creatures, if you have a Deep Cavern Bat in play, that's the better target for the Gifter because the Bat has lifelink. So now you're not going to gain 1 life, you're going to gain 4 life. Now we get to a card that has gotten so much attention. It was one of the first spoilers from Lorwyn Eclipsed, Bitter Bloom Bearer. It is a creature form of Bitter Blossom, right, from back in the day that loses 1 life and gives you a 1/1 flying fairy every single turn. And when people saw this, everybody thought, okay, yep, that's just going into Dimir Midrange or Dimir Fairies or whatever it is. There's a number of things that I want to say about this card. The first is that I actually saw this card in the spoilers and I thought, that's not really that great. And I thought that for a few reasons. One is the double black. The double black is hard because look, if you play an island on turn 1, all of a sudden you can't cast this on rate. Or if you find a Soulstone Sanctuary as your second land, you can't cast this on rate. The double black is really taxing. And look, with the old version of Dimir Midrange, when you always wanted to start with a Spyglass Siren, right now you can start with the Nuisance, right, which is still a 4 of, so you still have 4 1-mana blue 1/1-drops. But you see what I'm saying? You want to start with Spyglass Siren. Okay, I have an island. Great. Oh wait, I have a Bitter Bloom Bearer turn 1. Oh wait, I have Gloom Lake Verge and then island. Oh wait, I can't cast this. The double black is really taxing because now if you want to play more swamps or whatever, or more black sources to try to play this by turn 2, well now you might not have blue to play your Spyglass Siren or to play your Flitterwing Nuisance, right? So I saw that as a massive downside to this card, and let me tell you, playing with it, It is. It really is a big downside. Not only that, the fact that it's a 1/1, it's not even like a 2/1. I think a 1/2 would be a little bit too strong because then it's just slightly harder to remove, right? But it's not even a 2/1, it's a 1/1, and you lose a life every turn, you just make a 1/1. So now you have all these 1/1s, but you're losing a life every turn. I was really skeptical about this card, but there is the potential here to draw a whole bunch of cards with something like Enduring Curiosity, right? Or having another unblocked creature to ninjutsu and Kaido. So that's the upside. But really, between the double black and the life loss and the fact that it's a 1/1 and it makes all 1/1s and the fact that Iroh's Demonstration is a card that exists, I was just like, I don't think this card is going to be that good. I thought it was just mid. I wasn't even sure if I was going to play it. However, what I will say is I was wrong. This card is awesome. I was seriously undervaluing it. It is really good. There are all these situations where it just carries a lot of weight. It makes a blocker every single turn. I can ninjutsu in Kaido on the next turn, but then still have a creature behind to block and protect Kaido, or just have another creature in play and then I can replay it. The fact that it has flash and it can come down after the Pyroclasm or after the Day of Judgment or after the Iroh's Demonstration or all that stuff, I was really undervaluing it. It is very, very good. But that being said, yes, the double black really is an issue. The life loss really can be an issue, and that's why I'm only running 3 copies. I have seen so many lists, including lists that were being played at the Pro Tour, that ran 4 copies of this, and I think that is just wrong. I think 4 copies is way too much. It is too taxing on the deck with the double black and with the life loss. You can't play 2 of these on the field. Losing 2 life every single turn just from this, and then you're losing all the life from the Shocklands and from the starting town and all this stuff. Like, dude, you're just gonna kill yourself off of your life loss just from your own things. So the fact that I only want 1 on the field at a time, and the fact that it's double black and that is extremely taxing, I'm only playing 3 copies, and for a while I was only playing 2 copies. But it is an extremely powerful card. It is an extremely valuable card that has a lot of potential. I do think the 3 copies is worth it. Moving on to another new card that was really on my radar, Glen Elendra Guardian. 3/4 that enters with a -1/-1 counter on it, but then you can remove a counter from it to counter a non-creature spell. The downside is your opponent will draw a card. But this is a really nice quality of life addition to Dimir Midrange, because look, against control decks, Tidebinder doesn't really do anything. It can in some situations, like if your opponent is playing Beza or Elspeth or something like that, that is a little bit valuable. It can also maybe counter like an activation of a land or something like that. But otherwise, you would rather have something else, and this Glen Elendra is such a good creature to fill that slot. Just think of it like this. What if you don't have a Kaido that you can ninjutsu in on turn 3? Or what if you do have a Kaido, but it doesn't seem worth it to ninjutsu in for whatever reason? Well, this is a great creature to slot in and play instead at the end of your opponent's turn. If your opponent counters it because you're going up against a control deck, okay, use your Normalize on my Glen Elendra Guardian, and now I can cast my Enduring Curiosity for free because you already used your counter spell. That being said, it does feel like more of a sideboard card, and it is. I think you can get away with not main decking this. The reason why I am main decking it though is, look, on the arena ladder, you have no idea what you're going up against. It could be control decks, it could be a Greed's Gambit deck, it could be Lessons, it could be creatures, it could be mono red, it could be mono black, whatever, right? There's such a wide range of decks that people play on the arena ladder right now that you don't know what you're going to get into, and sometimes you just need something that can work against non-creature spells. So that's why I'm playing 1 copy of this for the arena ladder. If I was going to an event though, I would not main deck this. This would just be in the sideboard. 2 copies of Tidebinder. So the only thing that I think is worthwhile discussing about this is why only 2 copies and not like 3 or 4 that you'll see in other lists. I think 4 copies of Tidebinder is way too much. If your opponent doesn't have something that you can target with this, then this is just a 3/2 for 3 mana, which is pretty good. It can get in for damage, but it dies so easily. 2 toughness, it dies to like literally everything. So I don't think that there are enough worthwhile things in the meta to target with Tidebinder. You can target, like a really good target for this is the World Wagon, because then it can't be crewed. But if you target like a monument with this, your opponent's just going to kill it with Firebending Lesson anyway. Or if you target a Noroboid, your opponent probably has tons of mana, or they have a Nature's Rhythm, they can just go get something else, right? Against those Cub decks, they just go too big and too over the top. Even Ally spell-wise, they just go too big, too over the top, too much value for Tiebinder to really be worth it. I mean, if you're going up against Bant airbending and you Tiebinder something, they can just airbend it away, and then the Tiebinder's not tied to anything anymore. I think 3 is as high as you want to go, but for the reasons that I was explaining earlier, you know, I took 1 down just to put in the Glenolendra in case I'm going up against a deck that plays a lot of non-creature spells. As far as the cat, in pretty much every single iteration of Dimir Midrange that I have done, I've always included 3 copies of Enduring Curiosity and not 4. I've never included 4 because I always felt that 4 just clogs up your hand. If you have multiple Curiosities in your hand, it seems like it would be great, but it's not. It is too slow, and that's not what you want. You need cheap, early pieces of interaction instead of multiple copies of Curiosity. And honestly, the rest of Dimir Midrange has kind of caught on. You will be hard pressed to find a Dimir Midrange list now that runs 4 copies of Curiosity. People have been doing 3 copies of Curiosity for the past few months already. Now we get to something interesting. Kaito. There's only 3 copies of him in here. Every other Dimir Midrange video that I've done, I've had 4 copies of Kaito. Not only that, in my last Dimir Midrange video, I was very adamant about having 4 copies of Kaito. I talked a lot about it because I said this is the power play. All the other things, they don't really pose that big of a threat. They're kind of annoying to deal with, or they interact with your opponent's stuff. That's great, but you need something to actually get in and threaten your opponent with. And I said that that's Kaito. I've always had 4 copies of Kaito, even going back to the start of the summer last year when I put my first Dimir Midrange video out. And other deck lists have started doing that. They've started running 4 copies of Kaito and 3 copies of Curiosity. This is the way it's been for the past couple months. But I have changed. So why? Why have I gone against myself? Since Avatar came out, Dimir Midrange is just not as strong as it was. The other decks are just way too fast. There are too many creature-based decks that just go over the top. I used to think that Kaito is one of the best turn 3, Ninjutsu and Kaito is one of the best turn 3 plays you can make in the entire format. I do still think that, yes, that is a very strong play, but the problem is that if you're on the draw for your first game and you ninjutsu and Kaito on turn 3, you leave yourself wide open for the game-ending turn 4 plays that all these other decks do. Bant Airbending, Sultai Reanimator, Bant Rhythm, or just Simic Rhythm, or Simic Omniscience. Whatever it is, you leave yourself wide open because you're tapped out and your opponent's just going to play their mega turn 4 play that just pretty much ends the game on the spot. And you have a Kaito in play, and that's just not good enough. Not only that, the rhythm decks, both Simic and Bant and all this stuff, they can just end the game on turn 3 because they might tutor up a Crater Hoof Behemoth, and that's it. The game's over by turn 3. So what I found is that having 4 Kaitos in this standard meta unfortunately became a liability. There were too many situations where I had more than 1 Kaito in hand, which I used to think was great. There have even been some moments where I've had 2 Kaitos in hand and I've needed both Kaitos to actually close out the game. So I'm glad that I had more than 1. But now, with how fast everything is and how strong all of these creatures are, and with Formidable Speaker tutoring up the most powerful 4-drop that your opponent's going to do in the next turn or whatever, I was finding that multiple Kaitos in my hand was a liability. And not only that, I was finding that ninjutsuing him in on turn 3 was even sometimes a liability. It's like the first time that has started to happen in every other standard meta. For the most part, I felt like ninjutsuing Kaito on turn 3 was fine. It's like, all right, my opponent's going to get to respond, but now I have this planeswalker that does all this stuff. This is the first time when it's like, if I ninjutsu in Kaito right now on turn 3, I might lose on the next turn. So that's why I had to make this radical change to go down to only 3 copies to make room for the other cheap stuff, to make room for 1 more cheap piece of interaction, to make room for 1 more cheap creature or whatever it is, and this has just felt so much better. But I'm gonna come back to talking about Kaito again a little bit later. Next up are 2 pieces of interaction, 2 very important pieces of interaction that at this point everybody is familiar with from Lorwyn Eclipsed, Spell Snare. Wow, did we need this card? Oh my gosh, I am so glad that this card is printed. Now, if you're on the draw against a green deck, you're not going to lose because you can counter the Badgermole Cub potentially, right? See, that's why I'm main decking Spell Snares. Look, you don't know if off the die roll the first game, what if you're on the draw? If you're on the draw, Spell Snare is like one of the best cards that you can have in your opening hand. For a while, I thought that Spell Snare was just a sideboard card. And look, in all those versions that I was playing, and for those of you who joined me on stream, there were versions where I had it in the main deck, there were versions where I had it in the sideboard, and I was trying both, and blah, blah, blah. 2 in the main deck does feel right. I don't think you want to do more than that because there were situations where I was getting these spell snares like later on in the game or when they weren't relevant, and it's like, oh great, I have these 2 spell snares in my hand that I can't use, right? Like if I had more, like if I had 3 copies in the main or 4 copies in the main, I think 2 is the sweet spot. It works really well with all these 1-drops. See, I have all these 1-drops. I have 8 1-drops in here, not only to be able to steal potentially Ninjutsu and Kaido early on if I want to, or to just have more creatures in play so then I can draw cards off of Curiosity, draw cards off of Nuisance. But also, what if on turn 1 I have a Restless Reef, and I want to start with that? But then turn 2, I can play one of these 1-drops and then hold up Spell Snare. I mean, that's great, especially if I'm on the play. That's really, really good. That's a very good start to the game. 3 copies of Requiting Hex. Oh my gosh, I am so glad that this card exists. I have been wanting Fatal Push for the longest time, and I miss Cut Down with every fiber of my being. Ouroboros would not be playable in Standard if Cut Down still existed, but Requiting Hex is great. You know, look, Fatal Push and Cut Down are really, really strong removal spells, right? They're just very, very powerful. And Requiting Hex is kind of in the middle. You know, it's much better than the other 1-mana stuff that we had, like Stab and Tragic Trajectory, but it's not quite as powerful as those other 2 that I mentioned. It took me a long time to figure out how many copies of this do I want, because there were some situations where, oh man, I had 4 copies of this, and like if I had another one in the sideboard and I made it 4 copies, you know, if I brought it in, and it seemed like it would be really good, but then I wasn't getting enough targets for it, and it felt like, man, I think I need another thing in here. You know, I need something else. I need another cheap piece of removal to kind of go with this, to kind of complement this card. So that's why I only went down to 3, but this card does synergize extremely well with the Nuisance because you can blight. You can blight onto the Nuisance. It's only blight 1, so if you activate the Nuisance, you draw your cards, and now it's a 2/2, you can blight onto it, remove one of your opponent's things, you gain 2 life, and then the next turn, you can just activate it again. Now I said I wanted a piece of removal that complements this card, right? Well, that is a card from Wilds of Eldraine, which is Fairy Fencing. If you have a fairy in play, then the creature gets an additional -3/-3. So you can pay just 1 mana from this. Don't pay X, pay X equals 0, and it's 1 mana -3/-3. That is very, very powerful. Also, you just need to control a fairy as you cast this spell. So even if your opponent removes your fairy in response, like if you only have 1, then this still happens. Or 2 mana -4/-4, which is basically like Grasp of Darkness, right? That's also pretty good. But really, this is in here as a complement to Requiting Hex. It is now 1 mana -3/-3 in most cases, but I didn't want to run more than 1 copy of this because I didn't want to run the risk of not having a fairy in play, right? Which does happen sometimes. Speaking of fairies and fairy synergies, Spell Stutter. Spell Stutter is a card that I had in my first iteration of Dimir Midrange with the Fairy Masterminds because your opponent has to pay an additional 1 for each fairy you control. If you control a fairy, then all of a sudden this becomes Mana Leak. By the way, why is Mana Leak not in Standard? I mean, we got all these super powerful creatures and all these super powerful permanents that do all these things, but we don't have Visa of Interaction like Mana Leak to deal with all of them, right? But this is literally, if you have a fairy in play when you do this, it's Mana Leak, which is extremely potent. And look, if you have more fairies that you're making off of Bitterbloom Bearer, that's another piece of value that this card makes, because if you flash this in on turn 2, you're going to get 2 fairies on the next turn. Now this spell starter, you have to pay 4. You can counter any spell and your opponent has to pay 4. It suddenly becomes the best counterspell in the entire format, alongside, I guess, like Dispelling Exile if you Behold a Dragon. But this just scales up. You know, look, if I have a Dream Thief and then a Bearer, that's 3 fairies. Now you have to pay 5. You're not going to be able to do that. Even the Cub decks can't really do that. But this card is a big reason why I wanted to run more copies of Fairy Dream Thief. You know, I used to only have 2 with the 2 Cecils. Now I have 3, and then the 4 Nuisance instead of Spyglass Siren, because if you play one of these fairies on turn 1, you know, there's 7 fairies here that you might be able to get on turn 1, and you have a spell stutter, you have Mana Leak available by turn 2. That is a big reason why, on top of everything else, I wanted to play 4 Nuisance and then 3 copies of Dream Thief. Lastly, the usual suspects here for removal, Bitter Triumph and Shoot the Sheriff. I decided to go with 2 Bitter Triumphs because A, it does get rid of Planeswalkers as well, and there are just these situations where your opponent just has an outlaw and, oh man, I can't actually remove that thing, right? I need a Bitter Triumph. And also, look, what I was finding is that I don't mind discarding a card with this specific build of Dimir Midrange, because there are these situations where I have a Nuisance in my hand, but I already have one on the field. Okay, I'll discard it. I have a Bitter Moonbearer in my hand. I already have one in the field. Okay, I'll discard it. You know, I have a Gleamer Gifter, but it's too early for me to use it. Okay, you see what I'm saying? There's I have Glenelender Guardian, but it's irrelevant in this matchup. Now we get to another very radical change for me for Dimir Midrange. 24 lands, right? There's 24 lands in here, 22 creatures, and in every single other version of Dimir Midrange that I've made, I've had 25 lands, because I always said that I wanted that extra land because there were too many situations where I was trying to ninjutsu in Kaido on turn 3 and I couldn't do it, or I was trying to cast Enduring Curiosity by turn 4 and I couldn't do it, or whatever, or I wanted to like play something and then still have something else available and I couldn't do it. But I have gone down to 24 lands for a few reasons. One is that you do see a little bit more of the deck with this build. You know, obviously Fairy Dream Thief can help you look through the deck, but I've had Fairy Dream Thief in every single version. But really, this Nuisance, if you only have 3 lands and you don't have any other lands in your hand, well, this Nuisance, if you can attack with it, and you only need 2 creatures sometimes to get the value, that might be enough to find you that land. So between the Dream Thief, which again, you might build exile from a graveyard as well and draw an extra card, between the Dream Thief, the Nuisance, the Curiosity, the Kaido, there are a good amount of ways to look through the deck and potentially find your lands. But the biggest reason, the biggest realization that I had as to why I had to go down to 24 lands, Standard is just unfair right now. The rules are broken. All of the downsides of cards that exist, there are so many other cards in the pool that can work around those downsides. And unfortunately, Dimir Midrange, I can't believe I'm saying this, but it's the hard truth. Dimir Midrange is a fair deck. The only unfair things that you can do are get Kaido into play underneath a counterspell because you can ninjutsu him, or the fact that Enduring Curiosity draws you a card for every single creature and you can't really kill it because it comes back from the graveyard, you have to exile it, right? Otherwise, this is just a fair deck. And even those plays are not that good anymore. The other unfair plays are much more powerful than Enduring Curiosity and Kaido. I needed to have one more thing. I couldn't afford to just have a land. I needed to shove as many things as possible, every little piece of value into the main deck. You know, if I play 25 lands, all of a sudden, I can't play 3 copies of Requiting Hex. I can't play 2 copies of Spell Snare. I can only play 1. I can't have 8 1-drops and 8 2-drops, or I can't play Glenelender Guardian alongside a Dishonor. You know what I mean? It's just, I needed to shove as many things as I possibly could into the deck for it to just keep up. And the one that I removed was a Soulstone Sanctuary, because even though Soulstone Sanctuary synergizes really well with Kaido, it's just not that good anymore. You know, it can be airbent and then it goes away because you're not earthbending it in this deck. And if you have 4 mana available and you're just animating a Soulstone, or 5 mana available, you're just animating a Soulstone, that's really not that great. You'd rather have other things that you can do because your opponent's going to do some crazy thing in response, and now it's like, great, I'm tapped out, I can't do anything, right? And all this stuff. So instead, I structured the mana in a way that can allow me to play the Nuisance on turn 1, but potentially the Bitter Boom Bearer on turn 2, which is why I have 3 copies of Starting Town now, right? I didn't have any copies of Starting Town in my other Dimir Midrange builds. The Starting Town's really not that bad in this deck. You know, the curve is pretty low because I cut down on some of the top end, and with the surveilling and the card draw and stuff, you might not have to worry about keeping that Starting Town. You know, maybe you can get rid of it, you can discard it to Bitter Triumph or something, because maybe you find an untapped land after that. So there you go, some really radical changes for the main deck list for Dimir Midrange, right? And let me talk about the sideboard. This has also taken on a very different look. 2 copies of Duress. This probably isn't so surprising, really good in a whole bunch of matchups, but also 2 copies of Intimidation Tactics. These get sideboarded in a lot, man. There are so many creature-based decks, there are so many creature combo decks, and you just need to slot this right in, because if you play this on turn 1, you might be able to take away their thing, or in a similar manner to having the Spell Snare available alongside a 1-drop. Well, maybe you can play this on your second turn and then play a 1-drop alongside it. That's pretty good. A copy of Nowhere to Run, because Simic Omniscience has risen again, or Bant Omniscience, because it had a pretty strong showing at the SCG event a couple weeks ago, and now everybody's playing Kona again. So with Formidable Speaker being able to tutor up Kona, or tutor up your Meringue River Regent, or tutor up your Terror of the Peaks, the Nowhere to Run is like the only way, because it gets around Indestructible and it gets around Hexproof. A copy of Strategic Betrayal, no surprises here. Sultai Reanimator exists. And then here is the 4th Kaito, because Kaito is really strong in a number of matchups. It's really strong in Izzet Lessons, because they don't have a lot of ways to target Planeswalkers. They do have Seer, right? They have Seer now to be able to target him, but they probably don't main deck that. A lot of Izzet Lessons decks don't main deck Seer. And even if they do sideboard in Seer, guess what? They can't target him when he gets ninjutsu'd, and then you can just plus him up. He doesn't die to Seer anymore because he has 5 loyalty. He's also just really good against decks that go a little bit slower in general, right? If you go up against a deck that's a little bit slower and takes a little bit more time to set up, then Kaito is a really, really good addition. So having the 4th in the sideboard, this has proven to be the way to play the game, because there are when I had 4 copies of him in the main board, it felt like 60% of the time I was, maybe even more than that, maybe even like 70% of the time, I was sideboarding out 1 copy of Kaito. It's like, oh, gotta cut 1 Kaito, gotta cut 1 Kaito, gotta cut 2 Kaitos, or whatever it is. Like, why the heck am I even running 4 if most of the time I'm sideboarding him out? A copy of Annul, no surprises here. A copy of Soul Guide Lantern, no surprises here. I do find that the Soul Guide Lantern is a good piece to have alongside the Strategic Betrayal, because look, sometimes you just want that Soul Guide Lantern sitting on the field as a threat to potentially have your opponent play around it. Or like I was explaining, 1 mana, you can play this alongside one of your 1-drops, or if it's turn 3, you have 3 mana available, play this alongside one of your 2-drops, or play it and have removal, counterspell available, any of those things. A copy of Disdainful Stroke. So if you joined in on my streams, then you would have heard me say that I think Disdainful Stroke is more important now than it ever has been, because of the evoke creatures. The evoke creatures are always considered a spell mana value 4 or greater, even if they get evoked. So this counters them. So now you've got Impended Overlords, Warped Riddlers, or Warped Nova Hellkites, or whatever, and then the evoked elementals. There are so many targets for Disdainful Stroke now, on top of the Nature's Rhythms and the board wipes and the whatever else. A copy of Flash Freeze, no surprises here. A copy of Negate. I do like Negate as opposed to Spell Pierce, because Spell Pierce, of course, is conditional, but I think that if Glenelendra Guardian didn't exist, then I would play like a Spell Pierce and a Negate, because then having a 1 mana counter spell for non-creature and a 2 mana, well, that's pretty good. It's a little bit flexible, right? And of course, I have a second copy of Glenelendra in here. Get sideboarded in against control decks. You can just take the Tiebinders out. Here's a 3rd copy of Tiebinder, because Tiebinder is really good in certain matchups, especially Sultai Reanimator. Also pretty good against elemental decks, because if they have a Roaming Throne, then they'll get double triggers. But you know what if they don't, right? If they don't have a Roaming Throne in play, then this can just counter one of those triggers, and maybe it's the Deceit one that's going to pull something out of your hand, or whatever it is. And then 1 copy of Unagi. Unagi is really good in a number of matchups. Pretty good against control decks, because if they play an Unagi and you play an Unagi, well, they might have a hard time dealing with your Unagi, and you have a hard time dealing with their Unagi, but now they're just going to kind of stare at each other, right? But also, look, Unagi's really good against Izzet Lessons. And usually what I'll do is take out a Curiosity and put in an Unagi, because Curiosity gets exiled from Combustion Technique, and now you don't get it back, right? So the Unagi is much more difficult for Izzet Lessons to deal with. Unagi's also pretty good in the mirror. You know, if your opponent's playing interactive decks, I mean, look, if you're going to stun down an Unagi with a Kaito, you have to waterbend 4 to even do that, right? So that is my new build for Dimir Midrange. And like I said before, radically different, right? Very different build for me, but it's finally proven to be actually performing pretty well after all of that effort and all those different iterations. I want to talk about a few cards that are missing from this deck list, and I think you know which cards I might be talking about. Certainly one of them is very obvious, right? The first one I'm going to talk about is the most obvious one. Floodpitch Drowner. Where's Floodpitch Drowner? It's not here. So there's something about Floodpitch Drowner that I've mentioned in my other Dimir Midrange videos. What is the main downside? What does Floodpitch Drowner not have that so many of these other creatures have? It doesn't have flying. And look, Floodpitch Drowner still provides a ton of value, right? 2-1 with Vigilance, that's pretty good. And it can tap down an opponent's thing, put a stun counter on it, and if you ninjutsu with Kaido, then you can replay it, get another stun counter, tap down on it. That all seems really good, right? But it doesn't have flying. It can't get in for damage, and it is so important. It is so important. If there's one thing that has always remained true about Dimir Midrange, including now, you need to get in for a little bit of damage each turn. If you're not doing that, you're not going to win that game. The only way that Dimir Midrange wins games, you have to get in for 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces of damage every single turn, but then also hold up a piece of interaction so that then when your opponent responds, you can respond back, and then you have to have a way to refresh your hand with an Enduring Curiosity, a Nuisance, a Kaido, something like that, so that then the value keeps coming. If you just have these cheap creatures and you're not getting in for damage and you don't have a way to draw cards, all of a sudden your deck does nothing. So the fact that Floodpitch Drowner doesn't have flying, it really is a huge downside. You might not be able to get in for damage, and not only that, it's only got 1 toughness. It dies to literally anything. Your opponent blocks with Llanowar Werewolves, your opponent blocks with a Gene Pollinator, your opponent blocks with a 1/1 Otter. Anything your opponent plays an Iroh's Demonstration, it's just dead. When I was testing Dimir Midrange during the streams, I was still playing Floodpitch Drowner. I was saying, man, Floodpitch Drowner is still good, and it is. I do still think it's good, but it doesn't allow you to get in for that chip damage. It's the only way. It's seriously the only way that this weak, feeble deck that is Dimir Midrange can compete in the current meta. You gotta get in for a little bit of damage every single turn. So one thing that I can for sure say is that I don't think we're in a place where you can run 4 copies of Floodpitch Drowner anymore. Maybe 2, maybe 3. So if you like Floodpitch Drowner, you know, you can play it instead of Deep Cavern Bat, or maybe you trim a Gifter, you trim like something else, like you trim a Nuisance, right? And then you play 2 Drowners. That might be something good. The other big card that's missing from here is Preacher of the Schism. But I've talked about Preacher in most of my other videos. I really don't think that Preacher is in that good of a place anymore, because you just pay 3 mana to play this 2/4 that doesn't do anything when it enters, and you might be able to attack with it. You might be able to make a 1/1 lifelinker. You might draw a card. But look, it's a similar thing to Ninjutsu and Kaido on turn 3. You play that Preacher, okay, your opponent kills you on the next turn. Like, it's just... that Preacher is just not good enough. I think one of the main pieces of value that Preacher brought is that it could be another way to draw cards. You know, if you were ahead on life, then you could draw a card, and now it's not like you're only relying on Curiosity, only relying on Kaido to draw you cards. But the Nuisance fills that gap, and the Nuisance is better. If I'm going to pay 3 mana, I would rather draw 2 or 3 cards off of the Nuisance instead of playing a Preacher on the field. There's a few other possibilities here, something like Fabulum Trick. I was trying that for a while, but that's another card, like 3 mana. I don't think it does enough. That was a 2 mana spell that would easily be played, but I think if it was 2 mana, that would be a little bit too good. Another one is Ego Drain. Ego Drain seems like it would be pretty good because of all the fairies, right? Well, let me tell you, man, I had a few situations where I was playing Ego Drain, and I didn't have a fairy in play, and that sucked. So I think it's just a little bit too risky. You know, it's unlikely that you're not going to have a fairy in play with this many fairy. But I also think, look, Duress, Intimidation Tactics, like those cards are fine. Like those cards fill the void that you need for the hand disruption. And not only that, I did have a version with almost this exact kind of build. I think I still had 4 Kaidos and maybe only 2 Hexes, but then I didn't have the bats, right? I had the 2 Ego Drains. That was pretty good, but I wanted more creatures. You know, that was only 20 creatures. This is 22 creatures in here. And I just realized, wait a minute, instead of playing 2 Ego Drains, I could just play 2 copies of Bat. That is a similar thing, but then the Bat is another creature that can potentially do damage to draw cards, but it also synergizes really well with the Gifter. Like I said before, you know, I had that realization a little bit later. As far as the list itself, there are a few changes that you can make. Like maybe you don't play 3 Gambling Gifters, you only play 2, and then you play something else in here. Maybe you don't play the Guardian, and then you play 3 TIE Binders. That's fine. Just move the other Guardian to the sideboard. Maybe you don't play 4 Nuisances. There are some situations where 4 Nuisance feels a little bit too much, because if I draw an extra one, it's like, I don't want this extra one, right? Maybe you want to play a second Cecil instead. So that's enough talking about the deck. I had a lot of things to say, a lot of things to get off my chest. I do have some pretty interesting gameplay to show you. I chose 2 matches from before the rank reset when I was still in Mythic, and then 2 matches after the reset when I was replaced back in Platinum. There are some really interesting and really tense moments in those matches. Let's move on to the gameplay. I hope you all enjoy. Alright, here's my opening hand for the first game of the first match, which was really bad, starting with a tapped land and only 1 land in hand. This hand is much better, although not having a 1-drop is a little bit unfortunate, but hey, you know, deep being on the play, playing Deep Cavern Bat turn 2, that's pretty good, right? And look at this hand from my opponent. It's pretty interesting. There's a few lessons in here. There's a Voice of Victory and Enduring Curiosity. So it seems like it's an Azorius deck. And I was thinking this might just be like Azorius Flash with lessons, which is kind of interesting. But felt best to just take the get loss, you know, otherwise the bat just gets removed anyway, right? My opponent plays a Voice of Victory, and I can remove the Voice of Victory with Bitter Triumph, although they can follow it up with a second Voice of Victory, but look, if I don't kill that Voice of Victory, then I can't play anything on their turn, right? Voice of Victory is a really strong card against Dimir Midrange, and I can just get rid of one of these tapped lands. I don't need them both. And who knows, maybe next turn I draw a Requiting Hex or something like that, right? So my opponent missed a land drop there, and they played the second Voice of Victory, and I did find the Requiting Hex. I think my opponent not playing the Abandoned Attachments there was a huge mistake. You know, there's no reason to play the second Voice of Victory and miss your land drop with the Abandoned Attachments. Much better to just make sure that you find a land in that scenario. And look at this, they found an Agnikella on the next turn, right? So they would have been able to play that Agnikella on the last turn because they would have found it with the Abandoned Attachments. So that, I think, was a big missed opportunity there for my opponent to make sure that they hit the land drop. So I know this Kaido is going to get quenched, but I have another one anyway, so I don't care, right? So they counter my Kaido, but I have a backup. And then they can't abandon attachments on my turn to try to find a fourth land or whatever. So they do abandon attachments, and look at this. They discarded a archive. Can you believe that? And they missed the land. I cannot believe that my opponent did that. Not playing the abandoned attachments a turn sooner to try to find the Agnikella and discarding your fourth land when you have a Curiosity. That's crazy. And plus, that's a surveil land. Like, surveilling is good, you know? I can't believe that my opponent did that. So I'm going to take this Enduring Curiosity for myself because, look, if my opponent plays their Curiosity, I can play mine, but I'm attacking and I get the draw first, right? They do have a get lost for my Kaido, which I think is actually not so bad. I'm going to play this Curiosity, no counterspell, and I get to draw a card. And I can play this swamp and I can activate a map token. Obviously, I have a third Kaido in hand as well. And there's a Nuisance on top, which I am considering keeping because I can play Kaido and the Nuisance next turn. Right? I don't want a Ninjutsu Kaido because I don't want to take away my Curiosity of the bat, but I can just hard cast them and then play the Nuisance as well. But really, a couple of missteps here from my opponent, right? Not using the Abandoned Attachments to find the Agnikella, discarding the Meticulous Archive when that's your fourth land. So obviously, look, this is a lessons package, right? They have 2 Accumulate Wisdoms, right? They just got to Ancestral Recall. Well, that was not Ancestral Recall because they didn't have a discount from Grand, but still, 2 mana, draw 3. So now I get to draw 2 off of Enduring Curiosity, and I get to play a Nuisance. I'm going to plus up Kaido because it didn't feel like I needed to draw more cards at this point. It felt like I should just try to get in for some more damage, and if they have a get lost, then so be it. And actually, if they have a get lost, then I can potentially win off of the map tokens, right? So they play another Accumulate Wisdom, draw 3. And they do get lost Kaido, but now I can potentially win off these map tokens, right? And look at that, no land from my opponent, and they had to discard the hand size. So I'm going to activate the map, and there we go. There's a non-land card, so now I can win the game. So if my opponent didn't discard the archive, they would have 5 lands right now. But they did get unlucky. You know, they drew a bunch of cards with the Accumulate Wisdoms, and they didn't find another land. But I'm not sure how many lands they're playing in their deck if that's the case, right? They drew like, what, 6 cards off those 2 Wisdoms, and they didn't get another land? So I don't know. Maybe it's unlucky. Maybe they're not playing that many lands, right? So now I need to figure out how to sideboard against this. They're not playing that many creatures. So seemingly, you know, non-creature things that address non-creature spells like Glenelender Guardian might be good, right? So I'm thinking of putting in the other Glenelender Guardian. And I don't think Tiebinder is really that good in this matchup because if they have a Voice of Victory, Tiebinder doesn't really do anything. Unless they try to do something on my turn. Negate does seem good because there's a lot of non-creature spells that my opponent is playing, and I want to put in a little bit of Graveyard Hate. You know, they do have the Lessons package, so maybe the Strategic Betrayal and the Soul Guide Lantern can prevent them from drawing 3 cards with the Accumulate Wisdom. And I took out a Requiting Hex, but I'm second-guessing myself on that because of Voice of Victory, right? Voice of Victory kind of shuts down my deck. So I do want to make sure that I have removal for that, right? So I do put another Hex back in for Voice of Victory. Now I'm just thinking of like where to trim, you know? I decided to trim a Gifter because I need to trim something, and I decided to trim a counterspell. I think trimming the spell stutter was a good idea there because, again, if my opponent has a Voice of Victory, then my counterspells don't really do anything, right? I'm not too sure about trimming the Gifter, though. I think maybe trimming something else, you know, maybe trim a Flitterwing Nuisance, maybe trim a Kaido. Maybe that would have been better, right, instead of trimming the Gifter. This is my opening hand for the second game, which is actually pretty good. It's 5 lands, but I'm definitely going to need land drops against a deck like that. And look, Spell Snare is really strong in this case because it counters Voice of Victory, right? And Cecil is a good 1-drop in this matchup. This is a pretty good opening hand. And I drew a Nuisance, which is really good. I can hold up Spell Snare, and then I can Nuisance and Cecil. My opponent plays a tapped land and an Authority of the Consuls, which was a good sideboard for them. I mean, they also might just be main decking that, but... So I can play one of these creatures. I think playing Cecil is fine. I just kind of wanted to... I wasn't sure how much it is worth it, but I don't think there's a reason not to. There's Accumulate Wisdom, which I will counter because it felt like they were trying to search for a third land. I might be getting baited. You know, maybe they already have a third land, but I wanted to counter it in case they were looking for a third land, and they were. So I got, you know, it was a good read on my part, but they could have just been baiting me there, right, and had the third land anyway. But that's why I decided to counter it. And play a Nuisance, maybe draw 2 cards next turn. Voice of Victory comes down. And no third land from my opponent. So now I think it's better to draw 2 cards with the Nuisance here. Instead of leaving Cecil back as a blocker, because if Voice of Victory attacks me, then Cecil gets closer to flipping, right? And look, drawing 2 cards is good value here. Now I should have tapped differently though. I should have left the starting town available because now if I draw a blue card, I can't play it, right? I drew a Dream Thief anyway, but I should have left the starting town untapped. And there's a Requiting Hex on top, which I absolutely want, because now not only can I kill Voice of Victory, I can Blight onto the Nuisance. I can Blight onto the Nuisance and then activate it again, and then I'll draw more cards. This is what I was saying in the deck tech, man. That there's such a strong synergy between the Hex and the Nuisance. My opponent plays a second Voice of Victory, but again, no third land. So I'm just really outvaluing them now, right? So I'm going to Blight. I'm going to get rid of... I probably should have gotten rid of the untapped Voice of Victory, right? But I almost wanted them to block here, right? I felt like that even if they blocked, this was not a bad exchange for me. It also seemed like it would be unlikely if they blocked, but honestly, I didn't really care if they blocked here. So that's it. They don't block, and then I can activate the Nuisance. I'm going to draw 3 more cards. And now Cecil's going to flip next turn if they attack me as well. And look at this. Look at these options. So good. Soul Guide, Lantern, another Nuisance, a Kaido. Excellent draws. And that's it. My opponent concedes. So really strong synergy there, right, between the Hex and the Nuisance. Unfortunately, my opponent got a little bit screwed on mana, though. All right, here's my opening hand for the first game of the second match. And this does look pretty good. One issue, though, is that I can't cast Requiting Hex on turn 1. But I am on the play. I have Glamour Gifter, Kaido, 2 removal spells. If I draw a third land, then this is really good. Nothing from my opponent yet, and no land for me. And my opponent's playing a Goblin deck. See that? They played Eclipsed Realm on Goblin. So I'm going to play this Gifter just in case I get the third land. And I did. So now I can Ninjutsu and Kaido, get that Gifter back, and then that Gifter is going to become more valuable later, right? This is what I was explaining in the deck tech, is that now that Gifter becomes more valuable because if I use the emblem on Kaido, then whatever creature I target is going to get even bigger because it becomes all creature types. There's 2 lands on top, which I'm actually thinking of keeping both of those. I need lands, right? And they're both untapped basic lands. Cavern of Souls on Goblins, so now my counter spells won't do anything, and they play a Howl Squad Heavy, so they will be able to attack Kaido. It's not so bad, though. I do have ways of addressing this. I can Bitter Triumph the Heavy. I can also wait for it to trigger on my opponent's next turn and Tie Binder it, and then use Requiting Hex on the 1/1 token. So I do have some options here. Regardless, I am thinking of plussing Kaido up, because if my opponent plays any other haste stuff, then Kaido could be in trouble if I don't plus him up. So seems a good idea to plus him up and then get in for some more damage. And I can certainly discard this Glen Guardian, right? It's not going to really do anything in this matchup if my opponent's playing a bunch of creatures. But in retrospect, I think playing the Tidebinder and holding up the Hex actually really wouldn't have been a bad idea. But either way, I can still hold up the Hex. Because I kind of am it's a little bit more mana efficient to do it that way, right? Hold up the Hex and then play Tidebinder. My opponent's going to attack Kaido again. Now, my opponent plays a Bogart Mischief. Actually, well, I'm not sure if this is Boggarts or Bogarts, but... And I'm actually going to make a little mistake here. So what my opponent's planning to do is sacrifice that Goblin token that's on the field by blighting it. And then they'll get 2 more tokens after that happens. And now, with that enchantment on the field, every Goblin that dies, I lose 1 life and they gain 1 life. So... what I should have done was play the Requiting Hex on the Goblin token that was on the field. But I didn't do that, because if I did do that, they wouldn't be able to blight and they wouldn't be able to get those 2 other Goblin tokens. So now I'm kind of forced to use the Requiting Hex on one of these tokens, but they're going to get the trigger off of the enchantment and then there's still 1 left over. So definitely a mistake on my part, kind of just a result of not being familiar with these cards. Obviously, like, look, I should have read the card a little bit more carefully, but just an oversight on my part. I definitely should have used the Hex on that first token so they wouldn't be able to blight onto it. My opponent plays a Champion of the Weird. So, and they exile a Stadium Headliner. So when the champion dies, they can put the Stadium Headliner back in their hand. So I can wait for my opponent to do the blight and then Tidebinder it. But I'm actually thinking of playing the Tidebinder because I know if I attack with the Tidebinder, my opponent's going to block, right? Well, I mean, maybe they don't, right? But if they do, I'm going to Glamour Gifter on that Tidebinder, and then that Champion of the Weird is going to die. So they take the bait, and I can play the Glamour Gifter, and they, it becomes a 7/7, right? So my opponent knew about the Glamour Gifter, but I don't think they recognize that it gains all creature types, and then it becomes a 7/7 because of the emblems, right, on the field. And then I can follow up with a Cecil. So if my opponent knew if my opponent knew the card better, then they wouldn't have blocked there. But because they didn't, then they kind of paid for it, right? Even so, though, I think it's okay to play the Tidebinder there because I can. And if they do know how the card works, then it's another 3 damage that I get in for, right? Drawing Shoot the Sheriff is actually good. I can kill one of the headliners, and I'm thinking of just tapping down the other one and then swinging for a bunch of damage. Oh, wait, actually, it's lethal if I tap down the other one, right? Because it's 12 damage. So if I tap down the other one, then that is 12 damage. I did use the fact that my opponent was unfamiliar with Glamour Gifter to my advantage there a little bit. But I still think playing the Tidebinder was the right thing to do. Because even if my opponent doesn't block, then I can still get in with the 7 damage, right? Even if they decide to not block. So then that's another 7 damage that my opponent takes. So either way, I think it was a good exchange. That would have been 13 damage that turn. So I can certainly take out the Glenelendra. It's not so valuable here, but I am thinking of leaving in the Spell Stutters because even though they have Cavern of Souls, they have this Mischief that I'm probably going to want to counter. Now, Annul does take care of it, but I'm not sure if they have like removal spells or some other thing, right? So that's why I don't really want to play the Annul. I'd rather play Spell Stutter to at least counter something that's non-creature. I felt like taking out the Spell Snare because I didn't really see any cards there that are 2 mana. So I'm not sure how many 2 mana spells they really have. Spell Snare might not have enough targets. So instead of putting in Intimidation Tactics, that feels like a more useful card than Spell Snare in this scenario. And then just putting it nowhere to run since the Heavy, the Howl Squad Heavy, is a toughness of 3. And that's one of the better cards. So that will die to nowhere to run. So I think the only other thing that I could have done here maybe was put in the 3rd Tidebinder. All right, because a lot of their stuff are trigger effects. So I think maybe putting the 3rd Tidebinder there would have been a good thing to do as well. This opening hand is not bad. I mean, they already start with a Cavern of Souls, so my Spell Stutter is not going to really do much, but it at least might counter one of their non-creature spells. I decided to start with the Nuisance here. It might have been better to play the Hex, honestly, on this Stadium Headliner. My opponent does attack with the Stadium Headliner, and I'm actually okay taking this trade because I have a 2nd Nuisance in my hand. Now, my opponent doesn't know that, right? But yeah, no, I'll take that trade. Get rid of your Stadium Headliner, one of your better creatures, and which is also possibly a removal spell, right? They followed up with a second Stadium Headliner. I can Requiting Hex that thing, which I'm certainly considering doing. Starting town off the top, which isn't bad. Followed up with my second Nuisance. And at my end step, they are going to kill my Nuisance. So in response, I can Requiting Hex with a Blight. So now I can gain 2 life. So I think, you know, I think my opponent, I think they didn't need to remove my Nuisance there. Because that would have been a better attack because I didn't have a follow-up with the second Nuisance or a third Nuisance. They do follow this up themselves with a Howl Squad Heavy. This is a problem. I don't have a Tie Binder. And I didn't draw one, so I don't have a good answer for this. You know, I can play the Glamour Gifter to at least block one of these 1/1 tokens, but I'm going to need to find a removal spell or something for this heavy. I can block one of these 1/1s. And I'm just checking what the speed is, so they add mana, and there's the Tie Binder. So now at least I can Tie Binder the heavy. And I can block the 1/1. So, not looking so bad, right? Lock down this heavy. And now I do have Spell Starter available for a potential non-creature spell if they try to remove my Tie Binder or something, but they have a 5th land anyway, so that might be irrelevant. Drawing Curiosity there is good. I can attack with the Gifter, play Curiosity, draw a card. It probably would have been better there to leave the starting town untapped in case I found a Nuisance, right? Because then I could play it. My opponent's going to play a Champion of the Weird and bring back the heavy. And now they can use the Champion of the Weird, right, to blight. And I was kind of first thinking maybe I can just actually get rid of this Tie Binder because it's not doing anything. It's not tied to anything. Because if I do give it to the Curiosity, then sure, the Curiosity comes back when it dies, but it can't really attack, right? Because it won't trade with the champion. Now, the Tie Binder would, but I think maybe in that it might have been better to put on the Curiosity, but they're going to blight again, and they're going to blight onto the champion. And this is the mistake that I made. I got rid of the Glamour Gifter. I'm not really sure why I did that. I mean, the Curiosity is bigger than both of these creatures, so it can attack. That's kind of one thing I was thinking. Because then the Curiosity becomes a 2/1, right? But obviously the Curiosity comes back. So that was a mistake on my part. I shouldn't have done that. I should have definitely left the Glamour Gifter because for one thing, it can attack and then I would draw 2 cards with the Nuisance in play, right? I would draw 2 cards off of the Curiosity and the Nuisance. So that was a mistake. I'm not really sure exactly what I was thinking there. I was thinking that the Curiosity is bigger than both of these creatures, right? But that was a mistake. It would have been better to just blight onto the Curiosity and leave the Gifter in play. So now my opponent's going to lose the Champion of the Weird, but then they get the heavy back, right? So now it kind of feels like I should blight onto the Curiosity. You know, I'm going to lose my Nuisance and then I really don't have anything. But they're going to be able to play this heavy. And I don't have an answer for it, right? I can't Spell Stutter it. They have Cavern Souls. So I can at least next turn draw 2 cards to try to find removal. Right, because I can pay the 3 for the Nuisance, and then I'll draw off the Nuisance and the Curiosity. I could also, I could have blocked here, but I thought, no, it's better to draw 2 cards. Because I won't get the card draw if I had activated on my opponent's turn. Now I can Dream Thief to Surveil first, and there is removal on top. But here's the thing, I didn't check the type on the heavy. Right, because obviously Shoot the Sheriff is non-outlaw, right? It has to be non-outlaw. And is heavy an outlaw? It certainly is because it's a mercenary, right? So I didn't check the type. So unfortunately, I cannot remove it. Now I'm in a really bad place, right? I can at least play this other Dream Thief, but really not looking good here. There's a Spell Starter on top, which I don't want. It doesn't do anything. They followed up with another heavy, unfortunately for me, and then they add 3 mana because they're at max speed. And then they play a Grub's Command. So now they get a copy of the heavy, they mill, and they find a Bastronaut. So now they can play that as well. So this is just, I mean, this is terrible, right? I mean, this is just really awful. So I made some mistakes this game. I think that I didn't check the type on the shoot the sheriff and the heavy, or I didn't check the type on the heavy. And I do think blighting onto the gifter was also a pretty detrimental thing, right? I should have blighted onto the curiosity. I would have drawn another card, right? And then look at this. They can even just tap the heavy for extra mana, and now the Burnout Bastionite, you know, it's going to get like what? Like +8, plus whatever, and it has double strike. So that's just the game right there, right? Not the best execution on my part. Who knows if it would have made a difference anyway, right? Because my opponent top decked a heavy and then had the Grubs command to copy it and all that stuff. But I definitely could have played that much better. So I didn't really think I needed to change the sideboard too much. Again, really the only thing that was worth considering was probably the third Tidebinder, maybe an annul. And, you know, look, the spell setter obviously in that game didn't do anything, right? Because of they only played creatures. But I'm seeing non-creature spells. They have the Bogart thing, and then they have the Grubs command. So I didn't want to take out all my counter spells. I may need it for something. Speaking of, there's spell starters showing up in my opening hand. And this opening hand is pretty good, right? Tidebinder is really good in this matchup. And I actually probably should have started with the Dream Thief there. That was a slight misstep on my part because it's better to surveil. The nuisance isn't really doing anything yet, right? And if they have a Hex, then they would just remove it, and Hex is better to be played on the Dream Thief. So they start with this thing, the Mud Button Curse Tosser, a 2/1 that can't block, but when it dies, they get to remove a creature with power 2 or less. Or is it mana value 2 or less? I forget. Maybe mana value 2 or less. So that's it. So I'm going to hold up Spell Stutter here because they don't have a Cavern yet, but they could be holding a Cavern, right? So there's an argument to be made that maybe I hold up Tidebinder instead. I decided not to, you know, just play the Dream Thief and see what we get. Now there's a Bitterbloom Bearer on top. This is really like, because if they play the heavy, I can counter it. But what if they play Cavern Souls, right? Then I can't counter it. If I play the Bitterbloom Bearer, then I can trade 1-for-1 with my, you know what I mean? They'll make a token every turn, but I'll make a token every turn. They kind of 1-for-1 trade each other. But I feel like that's a losing exchange for me because I lose 1 life every time the Bearer makes a token. And not only that, if they play the Bogart thing, then I'm going to lose another life whenever their Goblin dies. So it felt like maybe not. Maybe the Bearer is not the best in this matchup. I also didn't attack here because I knew that they were holding Requiting Hex. And I wanted to see if I could bait them out to use it because I don't want to use my Spell Stutter. I want to use it on the heavy, right? And they did. So the reason why I did that is because if I had attacked with the Nuisance, maybe they use the Hex, maybe they don't. I don't think they would because the point is that I would have 2 blockers for the Curse Tosser, right? So I could block and then they could use the Curse Talker to kill the other one. But I wanted to see if they would use the Hex on my Nuisance so that then I would still have a blocker for the Curse Tosser. That's why I did that. Because now when the Curse Talker dies and it tries, there's nothing left for it to remove, right? So it felt like making them use the Hex on the Nuisance there was better so that I can, because otherwise they 2-for-1 and they still have the Hex in play. So they do play the heavy, they play it post-combat. No Caverner Souls, so I can counter it. And I unfortunately drew a land, but now I have Tidebinder for another heavy, or something else if they play that. They do play another heavy. So I'm going to Tidebinder it. And I drew a Nuisance, which is not bad. I can attack with this Tidebinder, and if they don't block, then I'm going to draw a card. And I did decide to shock that land in because if I draw a 1-drop, then I can still play it. And maybe I didn't need to because if I don't draw a 1-drop, then I took 2 damage for nothing, right? And I could have made that passage any color. So I actually didn't need to shock it in there. So they do have a removal spell, it seems like. So they're going to remove my Nuisance and they're going to take away my blocker. But it still felt like drawing a card here was worth it. Because, look, I have nothing. Right? I just have a land in my hand. I drew a Nowhere to Run, which is good. And kill the heavy. And they play a Seer Slicer Goblin, which is a problem because they attack this turn and they're going to be able to make a token. And they play a Bogart Mischief. So this is an issue because they can Blight, make 2 Goblin tokens, and then they get another Goblin off of the Seer Slicer Goblin. So that was a huge turn for them. I do think I did the best that I could with what I had. You know, again, I just had a land in hand. And maybe I don't attack with the Tiebinder, right? Because I can hold it back as a blocker and then attack with the Nuisance the next turn and draw a card that way. But I felt like I needed to try to find some action. I do have this nowhere to run, so I can block a Goblin and kill the Seer Slicer Goblin. But unfortunately, my opponent's going to gain life off this and I'm going to lose life, right? Because of the Bogart Mischief. My opponent decides to not attack with the Seer Slicer and the Heavy. So I can block one of these 1/1s. And then I can kill the Seer Slicer. But look, I'm going to go down to 6 life, right? This is really tough. I'm going to look at my opponent. My opponent's at 17 life. And every one of these Goblins that I kill, they're going to gain life and I'm going to lose life off this. So, I mean, how the heck am I even going to race my opponent here, right? I drew Curiosity off the top, which is good. And I'm thinking of attacking, you know, even if my opponent blocks here, you know, I lose a life, they gain a life, but if they don't block, then I draw a card. It would certainly be smarter for my opponent to block here, right? Because the Heavy's not doing anything. It's tied to the Tiebinder. I lose life, they gain life. And then I can follow up with the Curiosity, which can block one of the 1/1s. You can block the other 1/1, but every Goblin that I kill, I'm getting closer to death. My opponent does block, which is a smart thing to do. I'm not going to play my Curiosity yet. Down to 4 life. My opponent attacks, of course. I can take a block, but now I'm going to go down to 2. Down to 2 life. I drew a Soulstone Sanctuary. And for some reason, I activated it. I have no idea why I did that, y'all. I was just really a little bit shook at this point because I was a little bit disappointed in how I played the second game. So I was a little bit shook at this point. So I don't know why I did. I mean, look, I just drew 2 lands anyway, right? But still, that was just silly, right? There's no reason to activate the Sanctuary there. And they follow up with a Bastionaut. So now, this is it, man. They can attack. And I have to block, I go down to 1, and if I kill this Bastionaut, then I lose the game, right? This is it, it's over. Like, even if I attack, they can just block with the Bastionaut and then I lose. But look at what I drew. I drew a Requiting Hex. Well, wait a minute, if I remove the Bastionaut and clear the way, then I still lose the game, right? No, because I can Blight. I can Blight 1, and I'm going to gain 2 life, and that happens as you cast. It happens as you cast the spell because it's an additional cost. So I'm going to Blight onto the Curiosity. I'm going to gain 2 life before the Bogart Mischief triggers. And then that Bastionaut's going to die, but I'm going to be at 3 life, and then I go down to 2. So that Hex, man, saved this game for me. Because, look, obviously I wasn't playing this super well, right? I made some mistakes here. But the deck pulled through for me, right? I got the Requiting Hex, which is exactly what I needed in that moment. And, well, look, I've also drawn a lot of lands this game, right? I drew a lot of lands here. But still, you know, I definitely could have played better, but the deck ended up bailing me out. So my opponent just drew a land, so that's it, right? The game is over. I can just swing for lethal next turn. What a crazy end to the game, though, right? If it was any other card other than Hex, I would have lost. Well, Kaido would have worked because I could have stunned the Goblin, right? But still, really interesting match and really interesting deck from my opponent, right? A lot of cards from Lorwyn Eclipsed. All right, here's my opening hand for the first game of the third match. It's not that great, but it's also not bad. And an important aspect about this hand, guys, is that it actually draws really well. I mean, I drew a Watery Grave off the top, which isn't good. But if I draw one of my 2-drops, or if I draw one of my 1-drops here, or possibly another piece of interaction, this hand is actually pretty good. So I can at least start with a Requiting Hex, and I didn't Requiting Hex the Elves because I want to see what they play on turn 2, if they play a Cub or whatever. They play a Leyline Weaver, which is a better target for Requiting Hex because it blocks all my flyers, so I can get rid of that. And, you know, look, I can curve out, if I find something this next turn, then I can curve out into Tiebinder and Curiosity. And I did find something. I found a Bitterbloom Bearer. So it did pay off, me keeping this hand, right? It wasn't that great, but it did draw pretty well, and I drew into a Bitterbloom Bearer. Now, my opponent plays a second Leyline Weaver, which is really unfortunate for me. My 1/1 flyers will not get through. But I'm still going to play this Bitterbloom Bearer. It gives me a creature every turn, right? Make my 1/1, and I drew a Nuisance. Not really the best draw there. It could become relevant because the Nuisance plus Enduring Curiosity, that's a lot of card draw, right? So we'll see what happens with that. At this point, it did feel like it's just best to hold up Tidebinder. If you notice, my opponent has plenty of mana. They can easily cast a Quantum Riddler. They can cast an Ouroboros. I was also thinking maybe I'm going to want to Tidebinder that Leyline Weaver. So if my opponent like warps a Quantum Riddler, for example, I might just want to Tidebinder the Weaver to get rid of the ability for it to tap for mana, the ability for it to untap when you play a mana value 4 or greater, but then also to get rid of the reach. So I'm going to see what my opponent does here. Shocking in Breeding Pool. And Nature's Rhythm for 4. Gee, I wonder what card they're going to go get, right? What could they possibly want for 4 mana? So one thing is that they actually could go get Brightglass Gearhulk, right? Because this is the Bant deck. It's Bant Rhythm. They didn't. They went to go get Ouroboros. Now, if they had gotten Gearhulk, I could have just Tidebindered that as well. But regardless, if it was Gearhulk or Ouroboros, it's actually favorable that it's Ouroboros and I can Tidebinder it because the Gearhulk could still attack as a 4/4, right? It wouldn't have trample and stuff, and they wouldn't be able to get the things from their library. But the Ouroboros is the more favorable choice there for me. Now, I drew a Fairy Fencing. This is a really good draw because I can kill that Leyline Weaver. I don't need to worry about the Ouroboros. It's Tidebinder. They would need to get rid of the Tidebinder to get their Ouroboros back online. That Fairy Fencing was an excellent draw, and I could pay just 1 mana, -3/-3, the Weaver. I don't have the mana to play the Nuisance and then do the card draw because I would need 5 mana for that, right? 1 for the Fencing, 1 for the Nuisance, and then 3 for the Nuisance activation. But it's still good. I can get the Nuisance down on the field. I can play one of these lands tapped, and then next turn I can maybe draw some cards. So good draws there from me, right? My opponent curved out quite well, but I just had good draws. You know, I had what I needed to answer what my opponent was doing. Tap land and Nuisance, and then pass the turn back to my opponent. So now watch this. Watch what my opponent does. Mockingbird for 4. Mockingbird for 4, copying Ouroboros, man. How about, now they actually didn't need to pay X = 4. They messed up a little bit, right? They didn't have to tap their elf because they could attack with the elf then. Well, maybe they wouldn't because I would have blockers, but you know, they could have just paid X = 3. So they actually made a small mistake there. But regardless, there's an active Ouroboros on the other side, right? So what am I going to do here? If you look at this, I can actually get in with a lot of attackers. They only have 1 blocker. And I can activate the Nuisance for 3 mana, and I'm going to draw a bunch of cards. My goal here is to draw a removal spell. I cannot mess around with whatever else my deck does or whatever else is in my hand. I need to draw a removal spell for this active Ouroboros. So if I attack with all 3 of these creatures and then activate the Nuisance, that's at least 3 cards that I'm going to draw. My opponent didn't block at all, so now I get to draw 4 cards. 4 cards deep to see if I can get a removal spell for this. That was the right thing to do, even putting my Bitterbloom Bearer at risk. No removal spell yet. No removal spell at all. So I got a little unlucky there, not finding a removal spell after drawing 4 cards. But I do have the mana to play the Deep Cavern Bat. Maybe there's something worthwhile in their hand that I can take. And there is. There's a Brightglass Gearhulk. So maybe that was better, right? Maybe that was better than finding a removal spell. Who knows? But even after that, watch what they top deck here. Another Mockingbird. Another Ouroboros. And they made the same mistake. That elf would be able to attack right now, but they tapped it. So 2 active Ouroboros on the other side of the field. But I'm in a similar situation that I was to the last turn, right? Because I can play this Enduring Curiosity, and I can attack with a bunch of my creatures and draw a bunch of cards. I need to find removal, right? That's the goal. Even if I just remove 1 Ouroboros, the fact that this Bitterbloom Bearer is making a blocker every single turn, that might be, and look, my opponent's at 8 life, right? My opponent's at 8 life. So I might be able to just have enough blockers, right, to just keep getting by. I mean, I'm just hitting in the air. I need to find removal, right? So my opponent's going to block both the bearer and the nuisance. So I'm going to lose my bearer. And now I'm going to draw 3 cards, right? Again, putting my bearer at risk there, but I need to dig through the deck, right? I need to find removal. Still didn't get it. I did get another Deep Cavern Bat, though, which is relevant because I can use it as a chump blocker against the Llanowar Elf, right? I think maybe it would have been better to actually play the Dream Thief there and play a tapped land because the life gain is irrelevant with that many Ouroboros, right? And I would have been able to surveil with the Dream Thief to see what's coming up. But, you know, I think maybe that would have been better. Play a tapped land and play the Dream Thief, surveil. Now I can give them back the elf, right? But if you look at this, if I had drawn a nuisance there, then I would have been able to play the Dream Thief and nuisance. I would have lethal next turn, right? They wouldn't be able to attack with both flyers. But as it is, I have to chump block. They get an elf. It is post-combat, though, so they can't, the elf doesn't get the buff. Unfortunately, I just drew a Cecil off the top. Now, I'm still in a similar situation, though. I want to just try to find removal, right? So if I play this second Curiosity and I attack with just 2 creatures, that's going to be 4 cards that I get. That seems pretty good, right? But here's the thing. I'm keeping track of how many attackers they have now, right? See, like I'm counting the number of blockers that I can play, and then I'm also looking at how many attackers they have. They have 6 attackers, and I currently have 6 blockers. So I have 3 blockers that I can play, including the Curiosity, right? I have the mana to do all that. So I can attack with 3 creatures, right? So I'm thinking like, do I play the second Curiosity and draw 6 cards? Maybe, but I was also wondering like, what if I draw removal and then I want to still be able to play 3 blockers because they get like a Melt Strider's Resolve or something. You know what I mean? They remove one of my flyers. So I was a little bit apprehensive to actually play the Curiosity because then if I do find a removal spell, but they get rid of like one of my flyers and they have too many attackers, I was just a little apprehensive. I think in retrospect, it might not have, I was overthinking it a little bit. It probably would have been better to just play the second Curiosity, but you see what's going on here. Now I'm playing my 3 blockers, the Cecil, the Fairy Dream Thief, and the Bitterbloom Bearer. But if I had found a removal spell, then I would still have mana to do all of this, right? I wouldn't have mana to be able to play the Curiosity. Or if I played the Curiosity, I wouldn't have mana to play all 3 of these creatures, right? Plus the removal spell, I mean. So I think I was overthinking it a little bit. I think it would have been better to just play the second Curiosity there. But this way, at least I know I have enough blockers, right? And they play a Leyline Weaver, which is actually fine because I have lethal next turn with just my flyers, right? I have enough blockers. I can play the second Curiosity now because they didn't kill one of my flyers and they don't have another flyer. So they attack with everything. I can play the second Curiosity, and I mean, I'm just gonna win next turn regardless, right? Because I have 3 attackers in the air. So can play the second Curiosity, and then I'm just making sure that I have enough blockers again, which I do. I have 5 on the field, and then Curiosity will be 6, and there are 6 attackers. So playing the Curiosity, and I'm going to declare all my blocks. And it's another situation where, so certainly need to block the flying ones with the flyers, right? But it didn't really matter how I blocked here. But I could have just put them on anything because I have lethal next turn. But this is exactly what I was saying in the deck tech. This Bitterbloom Bearer is really, really strong in certain matchups. The fact that my opponent doesn't have, if my opponent had trample, I was just dead. Right? If my opponent had trample, I was totally dead. But look at how much weight this bearer carried this game. The bearer ended up dying to the Ouroboros earlier, but it made so many blockers and so many attackers. And I was just getting it for chip damage every single turn. A little bit of damage each turn, a little bit of damage each turn. And it was enough, right? My Curiosities come back, and then there's to shoot the Sheriff anyway, right? So if I had played the second Curiosity on the last turn, I would have found it. So I do think that was a slight mistake, right? I probably could have just not... if I had played the Shoot the Sheriff, right, then they only have 5 attackers. I still have 5 blockers, right? So, but regardless, totally worked out. And now we go on to sideboarding, and this is a matchup where the deck does get a little bit better after sideboarding because I can put in things like Flash Freeze, I can put in Disdainful Stroke, right, Intimidation Tactics. These are all pretty good pieces against this deck. And I can take out some of the other things that aren't, quite as relevant. I can trim down the number of creatures, for example, right, in favor of a little bit more of this interactive stuff. Now I'm just organizing my sideboard, putting in the 2 counter spells that I've added, plus all my removal. I'm just trying to, this is a nice way to kind of keep track of what you're sideboarding in and how much interaction you actually have. You can see right now that I have 12 pieces of interaction. There's 6 counter spells and then 6 removal spells, which is a lot, but it does feel a little bit appropriate almost, right? And I took these tactics out, but I ended up putting them back in. I'm not really sure why I decided to take them out, but I put them back in. It's definitely good in this matchup. Organizing your things that you're sideboarding in like this really helps to kind of figure out what you're going to trim down. In this case, like I said, I can trim down the number of creatures, right? Deep Cavern Bat is still really good in this matchup. I don't want to take it out. I can take out a Gifter. I can take out a Nuisance. And then I'm kind of thinking of maybe trimming like one more creature or something, right? Maybe trimming a Kaido as well. Kaido is still really relevant in this matchup, right? Because if they play a big creature, you can tap it down with him. Or it can help me find some more cards because I got all these flyers and they're going to probably be unblocked, right? So instead I decided to trim a Spell Stutter, which did feel like the right thing to do, because even though I can increase the amount of mana my opponent needs to pay if I have a fairy in play. I mean, look, if I don't have a fairy in play by the time I play that card, they're certainly going to be able to pay it. And even if it's one fairy and I have mana leak, 3 mana is not that hard for this deck to produce, right? So that felt like the right thing to do. One more, trim down a Spell Stutter. The other counter spells are more effective, right? Here's my opening hand for the second game, which is awful. I absolutely need to mulligan this. This is much better, but it's a little bit tricky, right? Every card in here is good, and I need to get rid of one. I was initially thinking of getting rid of the Dream Thief, but then I realized, wait a minute, if I don't have a fairy in play, then that fairy fencing sucks, right? Because I don't get the 1 mana -3/-3. So actually, I might need that Dream Thief because that fairy fencing is really not that good without it. And I mean, what do? I'm certainly not going to get rid of the Bat, right? Do I get rid of the Tidebinder? I was thinking of getting rid of the Tidebinder here, but I think I should have just gotten rid of a land. Fairy Dream Thief can help me find the land. Tidebinder is still decent in this matchup, especially with Gear Hulk, right? So I think that was a slight mistake on my part. It would have been better to keep and look, I found the land anyway, right? But it would have been better to keep the Tidebinder there. Now there's a Requiting Hex on top, which is really good. So now I got Fairy Fencing plus Requiting Hex. And my opponent doesn't play a Badgermole Cub. They just play a second elf. And then they play a Gene Pollinator. And then it's half lands. So now I have some options here. I decided to go for the Bat because I'm like, okay, they have all this mana. Let me see what their payoff is going to be, right? I think in retrospect, y'all, it would have been better actually because without a Cub, right? If I just get rid of both of those Llanowar Elves and they don't have a lot of mana available, I think really it would have been better in this situation to play the Hex and the Fencing on the Elves to get rid of them. Because then they only have 2 mana available, third one if they find a land, right? That's not so bad. So I think really that would have been the better thing and save the Deep Cavern Bat because I can go for it later. Now in this situation, I kind of have to take the Meltstrider's Resolve because otherwise the Bat's just going to die. And if I take the Formidable Speaker, they can still cast it after getting rid of it with the Meltstrider's Resolve, right? So now I'm in a bit of a tricky spot because that was a good hand for my opponent. They also found their third land. And I take the Meltstrider's Resolve, but then they have 2 cards left over that are still good for them, right? So really, I think playing the 2 removal spells on the 2 elves was the better way to go. So now they can copy my Bat with the Mockingbird, which was a good choice for them instead of going for the Formidable Speaker. It's tempting to play the Speaker there and go find an Ouroboros because you have a Mockingbird, right? You get 2 Ouroboros. But my opponent decided to play it a little bit more conservatively and copy my Bat. But I did find a Bitter Triumph off the top, which is good. So now I have 2 removal spells here. I don't want to use a removal spell on this Bat if I can avoid it, especially with a Fairy in play and having Fairy Fencing, right? Bitter Triumph, these are good removal spells here. But it does feel like I can actually probably attack here because if Deep Cavern Bats trade, it's somewhat favorable for me. I get a Requiting Hex and then I have 3 pieces of removal. My opponent has a Meltstrider's Resolve, but I can just remove whatever they play the Resolve on. seems pretty good, right? So I'm actually thinking of offering the trade here with the bat, because then I still have the Dream Thief back as a blocker, which is also a favorable trade for me, right? So I can attack with this bat, just a little bit of pressure, right? Just a little bit of pressure on my opponent. And this trade is favorable for me. And so would the other trade if my opponent attacks with the bat and I can block with the Dream Thief. So I think just a tiny mistake for me there, not killing the 2 elves with the 2 removal spells. But this is a good decision. Apply a little bit of pressure with my bat, because no matter what happens here, if my opponent ever trades, this is a favorable trade for me. My opponent didn't take the trade. I can play a tapped land. No reason to shock that in, because I'm probably not going to need both removal spells, right? Not on this turn. They play the speaker. And we'll see what they go get this time. They discard the land in their hand. And they got a Gear Hulk. So now that is really a problem, because when they play that Gear Hulk, they'll get another Mockingbird and they'll get a removal spell, right? Like Meltstrider's Resolve or something, or Seam Rip if they have that. So this is a big problem, because that Mockingbird can copy another Deep Hammer Bat. It can copy the Gear Hulk when it comes down. So this is an issue, right? I need to kind of top deck a Tie Binder here, it feels like. I'm just wondering, is it worth doing anything here? Is it worth killing this bat on the opposing side to get that Hex? I don't think so, but I'm a little bit worried that if I'm not being proactive here, then I'm going to kind of just get outvalued by that Gear Hulk. All right, so see, I'm really debating casting this Fairy Fencing. But at the same time, there are worse things that are going to happen here than killing that bat. Or Boroid. Gear Hulk. Another Gear Hulk. A Quantum Riddler. All these things are worse than that bat on the opposing side. And not only that, look, my opponent didn't take the trade with the bat. They might not take the trade again. And if they attack with the bat, I have the Fairy Dream Thief back as a blocker, which is a favorable trade. So it feels like I just kind of have to do nothing. It doesn't feel great that I have to do that, but I really think that that's my best option. Now, getting a Spell Snare there is actually good, because my opponent's going to play the Gear Hulk, they're going to get a Mockingbird. What are they going to copy, though? Are they going to copy Gear Hulk? Because I can kill the Gear Hulk with the Bitter Triumph. If I do that, then they might be tempted to copy the bat. If they copy the bat, I can Spell Snare it, because it will be 2 mana from the Mockingbird, right? So actually, that Spell Snare helps me out quite a lot. So attacking with the bat, again, just a little bit of pressure, puts my opponent in a tough spot where they can't really block, right? Again, these trades are favorable. So attack with the bat. And I'm thinking of just playing this land tapped. It doesn't feel like I need all of my interaction available, right? Pass on the turn. And now we'll just see what they do. They're certainly going to play Gear Hulk. They're going to get a 1-mana removal spell. And they can actually probably just, I don't know if they're going to get what removal spell they're going to get, but something on my side is probably going to be dead, right? Now, I think they got a little bit messed up on the mana there, because the Gene Pollinator tapped the bat. It probably would have been better for them to tap the starting town, but so that might have just been the auto tapper, right, messing them up. So here comes the Gear Hulk. I still don't think it's a good idea to respond, right? I might just remove this Gear Hulk with the Bitter Triumph, because they're going to get a Mockingbird and then they can't copy it. There we go. Mockingbird plus Seam Rip, so they're going to Seam Rip my bat, and there's nothing I can really do about it. I will at least be able to respond to whatever the Meltstriders, at least seemingly, right? Whatever they decide to target with Meltstriders Resolve, I'll probably be able to respond. So now watch this. Watch what my opponent does. My opponent attacks with the speaker. And do you see why this is a bad idea? Why is this a bad idea for my opponent? You see I'm hovering over the fencing? Why is this a bad idea? Because Fairy Fencing is -X/-X. So for 1 mana, I can declare this block. My Dream Thief will trade with the speaker. I mean, my Dream Thief will kill the speaker. It will not trade with the speaker, right? Because now it's -1/1. So that was a bad attack for my opponent. Now, that being said, I actually think that was a mistake on my part. Because think about it. Now they can play Meltstrider's Resolve, and I can't kill whatever they decide to put the Meltstrider's Resolve on, right? So actually, that was a silly attack from my opponent, because they knew that I had the fencing in my hand. But I think that on my end, I didn't need to do that. I think it would have been better to just save it as a removal. Because now look, their Meltstrider Resolve. on the bat, which was a good idea because the bat has lifelink. So this is going to be, it's going to do damage to my Dream Thief to kill it, and then the bat can still attack. So then it's going to do lifelink damage again. So I think maybe it would have been better for me to save the Fairy Fencing, right? But look, it was silly for my opponent to attack there. Now my opponent's still holding that Mockingbird, but I did find a Requiting Hex. It's like, I've been saying this a long time, guys. The Dream Thief is so valuable. I drew an extra card, I found the Bitterbloom Bear, but then I found this Hex. I would not have gotten that Hex if I didn't exile the Dream Thief from the graveyard to draw the extra card. And that Hex is really important because it gets rid of the copied Deep Cavern Bat. Now I have another Hex, and now look at what I got. Bitterbloom Bear plus Spell Snare. This is awesome. And they just have Mockingbird and some unknown card. Dream Thief is just so much value, man. Like, it's such an undervalued card. It's such an underplayed card. They play Coil and Catch on Meringue River Regions, which I think makes sense. You know, I don't think playing the dragon just by, because I could have another removal spell, right? Draw some cards. And my opponent plays a Badgermole Cub. So I can deal with this with Spell Snare, right? I don't want them to have a billion mana here available to them. My opponent plays a land, and they do not decide to attack with the Gene Pollinator. So I can play Bitterbloom Bear, right? The savior from the last game. And I also top deck a Kaido. This is just awesome, right? This is the deck really pulling through for me. And again, I think I found just the right mix of cards for this to happen. Really favorable. I have both blue and black available with both dual lands as well. Play the Kaido, surveil, draw a card, right? Kaido can't, there's no way they're going to be able to kill Kaido on the next turn. There's 2 lands there. I don't want them. Get rid of them. Really, I'm just curving out really well here. And I found a Glamour Gifter. That's an awesome draw with a Kaido on the field. See, this is what I was saying. Now the Glamour Gifter. Look at the value that this Gifter provides later on in the game. If I plus that Kaido up, whatever I target with that Gifter is going to get 4 additional power, because it's going to be a base 4/4, right? Well, if it's a 1/1, I mean. But then an extra 1 from the emblem from Kaido, because it gains all creature types. What an awesome draw that was, right? Now I can play Bitterbloom Bear. I'll get another 1/1. And I drew my flash freeze. I mean, for one thing, I sideboarded this extremely well, right? There have been a few sideboard cards here that have come in that have been relevant. But more importantly, I'm drawing extremely well, and I'm playing this with applying just enough pressure each turn, right? Just enough pressure each turn. Really, I think the only mistake that I made was early on in the game not destroying both of those elves. And my opponent didn't block for some reason. I have no idea why they didn't block the Kaido there. That's insane. And look at that. I found the Intimidation. The sideboarding. You know, I sideboarded just right. And I have seen a ton of cards this game, you know, between the surveilling and stuff like that. I can Intimidation Tactics. I can get rid of that Mockingbird right there. That's going to be a big problem. They have a Meltstrider's Resolve. It doesn't matter, right? I can Requiting Hex onto one of these cheap creatures. Now, they did top deck something. They did top deck something. They top deck the Quantum Riddler. So they're hard casting this, right? They're not warping it. I think hard casting it probably is a good choice because it's a good blocker against these 1/1s and stuff. And they're going to draw 2 cards off it. And now they can also Meltstrider's Resolve onto it, right? I do have Flash Freeze, which I'm going to have to use. I don't want to lose my Bitterbloom Bearer, right? So now I can tap down the Quantum Riddler with the Kaido, which is what I'm thinking of doing. I'm also not sure here if I want to play this Glamour Gifter, because the Glamour Gifter is a good idea to save because of the emblem from Kaido. I'll do more damage later. But look at this. If I play this Gifter right now, I have 4 damage in the air. I'm going to tap down the Quantum Riddler with the Kaido. So that's 2 turns, right? There's 4 damage in the air with the Gifter. And with the Riddler tap, they might not be able to block. It's tricky, though, because look, they can find another Quantum Riddler. They could find a Leyline Weaver. They could find a Meringue River Region, any of these things. And if I wait instead, then I might get to a point where, because I'm going to do 3 damage in the air next turn. if I use the plus up on Kaido, then if one flyer gets through, just one flyer, even if they have a block or whatever is going on, one flyer gets through, the Gleamer Gifter is lethal. It's a really tough choice, but I think it's better to actually hold it because I'm going to make another flyer off of the bearer, tap down this Riddler with the Kaido, and then if I plus him up on the turn after this, and I drew a Bitter Triumph anyway, right? So now I can just kill the Quantum Riddler and discard this Hex. This Hex isn't really doing anything. And I can still surveil with Kaido to find something else. Maybe I find another counterspell, right? Spell Stutter. But you see what I'm saying? It's actually better to hold the Gifter because if my opponent plays a blocker, they remove one of my flyers or whatever else, if just one flyer gets through and I plus up the Kaido on the next turn, then whatever creature gets targeted with the Gifter is going to be a 5/5. So that's why I decided to hold it. So now I'm going to attack, and I can surveil, draw a card. My opponent is going to block this time. Makes sense. They have a billion mana anyway. And now not only that, though, look, if I just play the Gifter, if my opponent doesn't have a blocker or whatever, right, then it is lethal. Surveilling, I don't really need either of these, right? I don't really need another land. I certainly don't need a second Bitterbloom Bearer. And I found a Dream Thief. That is excellent because now I do have lethal, right? I have lethal in the air just off of my flyers. There's another land on top. I don't really need that, right? Dude, this Dream Thief just provides so much value, man. Now I have lethal in the air, and that's it. My opponent did not find it. What a crazy game, right? Or a crazy match, I should say. Both of those games were insane. But, you know, I found just the right stuff that I needed. And in this game, I was applying just enough pressure each turn, right, to make it difficult for my opponent. And the sideboarding made a big difference in that game, too. All right, here's my opening hand for the first game of the fourth match, which looks really good. I can curve out quite nicely here into a potential Kaido. And my opponent is on Izzet Lessons. So instead of playing the Dream Thief, I'm going to Requiting Hex the Grand. I just don't want my opponent to be able to dig through their deck, especially with them mulliganing down to 6. And they don't have a second land. So with them, I was also trying to play around a potential counterspell there by hexing the Grand on my turn. And since they have a tapped land here, they don't have 2 lands, they can't play It'll Quench Ya, right? So there's a Gleamer Gifter here on top, which I was really debating keeping, especially with Kaido in hand. But I did think that Gifter was showing up a little bit too early. So I decided to bin it away instead. And I also wanted to, I didn't play the Bat because I'm going to Ninjutsu Kaito here if they didn't kill my Dream Thief. And I didn't play the second Dream Thief because I wanted to hold up the Fairy Fencing, right? Again, if I pay 1 mana there, I can just get rid of a Grand or an Otter token because 1 mana will give it -3/-3. So there's a Cecil on top with the Surveil, which is a good card in this matchup, but I didn't think I needed it. You know, I have other creatures to be able to play. And I also decided to Surveil there instead of plussing Kaido up because I'm not sure how many Lessons decks are really main decking Seer, but I found it unlikely. So I didn't, you know, Seer would kill Kaido there if I didn't plus him up. So I didn't plus him up because if my opponent doesn't main deck Seer, then I don't have to worry about that, right? My opponent does have a Spell Snare for my Deep Cavern Bat, but that's not such a big deal. I got plenty of other things that I can do here. So now it feels like I should plus Kaido up. I don't need to draw a card, especially with a Curiosity in hand. And look, I have good stuff, right? I don't need more cards. I just need to get in and do damage. So I can certainly shock in this Watery Grave. And now I'm just kind of wondering what I want to do here. I'm certainly going to play... well, I'm not sure if I'm going to play one of these Dream Thieves and hold up with Fairy Fencing. Do I play both Dream Thieves? Do I play the Bitterboom Bearer and all this stuff, right? If I play both Dream Thieves and my opponent has Iroh's Demonstration, that's pretty bad, right? It does feel like playing one Dream Thief is worthwhile to see what's on top, and there's a starting town, which I don't want, so I did think it was worth doing that. And the reason why I decided to play the second one is because even if my opponent does have an Iroh's Demonstration, that's 2 mana, so they can't put a Monument into play then. And you know, if they don't play an Iroh's Demonstration, then now maybe I play Curiosity and I can draw 3 cards, right? So I kind of wanted to give myself the option to play in that way, but they did have a Monument, and, you know, obviously I saw that I was getting the Spell Snare. So now it kind of feels like maybe it's better to just hold up mana here, right? Spell Snare can hit and accumulate Wisdom. Spell Snare can hit a second Artist Talent if they have a second one. Surveilling with Kaido reveals 2 cards that I don't want. I don't want the Tidebinder or a second Kaido, so let's try to get something better than that. It does kind of feel like holding up mana here is better, and I get a second Spell Snare anyway. It does feel like holding up the mana here is the better way to go. Kaido by himself is just lethal, right? So they would need a Boomerang Basics to get rid of him. So I'm going to counter this Accumulate Wisdom with the Spell Snare. And that's it. My opponent conceded. So I think I played around... I think I actually played that... I had a really good curve out, and my opponent didn't have a great curve out. They also mulliganed to 6. So now for the sideboard, there's a good amount of changes here that I want to make. Certainly cutting down on the fairies makes sense because they die so easily to their removal spells. And taking out Deep Cavern Bat makes sense as well because it dies to all their removal spells, including the second form of Iroh's Demonstration. And I'm going to trim a Curiosity here and put in an Unagi. Unagi is much harder for them to kill. And Enduring Curiosity gets exiled by Combustion Technique. So instead, I'm going to put in an Unagi, and I'm going to make room for the 4th Kaido because Kaido is very hard for them to interact with. Again, Seer is kind of like the only thing. And if I plus up Kaido, they're probably going to bring in Seer now, right? If I plus him up, though, then he doesn't die to Seer. And then they need a Boomerang Basics. That's kind of the only other way that they can deal with him. So just bring in counter spells, negate, annul, certainly going to do that. Certainly going to bring in duress, right? And then I don't need the big removal spells like Shoot Sheriff. I'm leaving in 1 Bitter Triumph, though, in case they bring in a Raw. And then I wanted to make room for the Soul Guide Lantern, so I decided to trim 1 Bitter Bloom Bearer, which makes sense, right? If I have a Bitter Bloom Bearer on there for a few turns, but then they just Iroh's Demonstration away all my fairies, then I lost like 2 or 3 life from the bearer from every turn, right? And I lost all my creatures that I'm going to draw cards off with Curiosity or whatever. So I think that makes sense. This is my opening hand for the second game, which also looks really good. Fairy Dream Thief, and then negate or Requiting Hex, and then into Kaido. Really good stuff. I don't need to hold up Requiting Hex this time. It feels better to hold the negate, but there's a duress on top. So now I'm thinking maybe I can play this duress and then hold up Requiting Hex. It was also tempting to hold up negate because I don't want them to kill my Dream Thief, right? But I figured, you know what? Even if they do, let me just see what's going on. And look at this hand, man. Their hand is loaded. So they don't have a 3rd land. So they're certainly going to abandon attachments here to try to find it. But this is a really hard choice. So for one thing, Spell Snare is going to take care of my negate. Whatever I try to negate, unless they're tapped out, they're going to Spell Snare it. The Iroh's Demonstration can kill my Bat. I mean, I can kill my Dream Thief and kill, you know, God knows whatever else I play. Seer can deal with Kaido, but if I plus up Kaido, then the Seer doesn't kill him. The most threatening cards are the Artist Talent and the Monument because those can kill me, right? So it's very tempting to take the Artist Talent here because Monument without a discard outlet doesn't really do anything, and they're going to use the Abandoned Attachments here. So if I get rid of the Artist Talent, they're going to play the Abandoned Attachments. They're not going to have a discard outlet. So that feels like the right thing to do, and then I'm going to need to try to just play around the other stuff. I'm going to need to try to play around the Iroh's Demonstration, play around the Spell Snare, and the Seers shouldn't be a problem because I can, if they don't kill my Dream Thief here, then I can just Ninjutsu Kaido in and plus them up. So we'll see what they do. You know, it felt like the right thing there to take the Artist Talent. They're going to play Abandoned Attachments here, certainly. They're not going to want to miss a land drop. That's what they're going to do. And they got rid of the Iroh's Demonstration. So now I'm like, okay, well, if you don't kill my Dream Thief, this Kaido's coming in, and this Kaido is not going to die to your Seer, right? So they leave their mana completely open. I'm going to attack, but they didn't kill the Dream Thief. I think they should have played the Seer on the Dream Thief there. They should not have let me attack. Because now I can just plus Kaido up, and that Seer is not going to do anything, right? So I think they made a little mistake there. I think they should have played the Seer on the Dream Thief of holding it. So now they play Monument to Endurance, and now they're able to hold up Spell Snare though. So seemingly that's why they didn't play the Monument on the last turn, because they want to hold up Spell Snare, which makes sense. Surveilling with Kaido reveals 2 cards that I don't want. They're 2 good cards, but it feels better to try to find an untapped land here, and I did not. So I can at least play the Reef. And now I'm like, do I hold up Tiebinder to stop this? You know, Tiebinder dies to everything in their deck for the most part. But I can use it to at least stall them out, right, if they try to trigger the Monument. But still, I don't know. It doesn't really feel that good to do that in this situation. If I Dream Thief, I can look 1 card deeper into my deck because I Surveil, and then I can just hold up Negate. They'll Spell Snare it, but, you know, it felt like, so what? They Spell Snare my Negate. You know, they use mana on their turn to do that, right? It felt like that wasn't such a bad exchange. They play a second Monument. I'm going to negate it, and they'll Spell Snare it, which I'm fine with. That takes their whole turn. I mean, I don't know if they have another land here, but seemingly it's going to take their whole turn. So there's the Spell Snare. There's a Monument. And that's it. So they got 2 Monuments that don't do anything. It would have been really nice to have found an untapped land there to activate the Reef. But I still have good options. I can attack with Kaido and I can Surveil. It doesn't die to Seer, right? So Surveil, find a card. And not only that, with the Tiebinder plus either Kaido or Reef is lethal next turn. So they need 2 removal spells, basically. They need the Seer plus something else, like Firebending Lesson or whatever. So I do have 1 mana to spare. I can play a Dream Thief, see what's there. And there's another land, which actually really isn't bad. At this point, I think that land wouldn't be that bad to keep. But I was also thinking, well, you know, look, they could have another burn spell for my Tiebinder. They could, you know, they can still survive another turn. And maybe I want something else other than a land, like my other Duress or something like that, right? So, but it does feel like I kind of have this game locked up, you know, with the Tiebinder, because just Tiebinder plus either Kaido or Reef is lethal. So I don't even need to play the Tiebinder to counter a Monument trigger. I can just play it. Rose Demonstration. That's actually not so bad in this case. Let them just kill my Dream Thieves. It's also, I kind of expected that, but really not a big deal. They don't do anything else. So I'm going to play Tiebinder. And then they seemingly can't remove both of my things, right? They would need like Boomerang Basics to get rid of Kaido, which they did not do, plus a Firebending Lesson for the Tiebinder, which if they do that now, then I still have lethal with Kaido and the Reef. So again, really good sequencing on my part to play around what my opponent was doing and take the most important card from their hand in that case, which was the discard outlet in the form of the Artist's Talent. Then they have these 2 Monuments in play that don't do anything, right? So that's it. Swing for lethal, mill myself, and that's the game. So I hope you all enjoyed this gameplay featuring my 4th brew for Dimir Midrange. Again, this took so much work. There are so many notes that I made, so many different versions of this deck that I had tried. For those of you who joined in on the streams and gave me feedback or gave me feedback in the Discord or whatever else, I very much appreciate it. I also just want to take a moment to thank you all for being a little patient with me as I needed to take a little bit of a break, a little bit of a mental reset to rethink this deck. It's been a while since I've uploaded a video, but I didn't want to half bake it. I wanted to make sure that I was providing something of value because some of you watch my videos and use my feedback or my input or my decks to bring to events and stuff like that. And I didn't want to put something out and then have you try it at an event and it seriously underperform for you, or I don't have enough interesting things to say or good analysis to provide you with. Finally, after all this work, I have something of value here for Dimir Midrange. But as I said in the beginning of this video, Dimir Midrange is nowhere near as strong as it was. It got a lot of interesting pieces in the Lorwyn Eclipsed set, but really those pieces haven't bolstered the deck in the same way that other decks have been bolstered. It's very hard for this deck to keep up when so many other decks are playing unfair. They have such powerful creatures, such powerful spells. And also, this deck is pretty unforgiving. If you make like 1 or 2 mistakes, that's probably it. That's going to cost you the game. This is not an easy deck to pilot. It's not an easy deck to play. And even as it is, even if you play it exactly right, it still just doesn't pull through sometimes. Your opponent can just top deck something, that is too powerful. You have like 4 cards in your hand, you've done everything right, but then your opponent just top decks something and that's it. If you enjoyed, then drop me a like to beat the YouTube algorithm and leave me some feedback in the comments. What do you all think about Dimir Midrange? Can it keep up in the current meta? Do you like these additions from Lorwyn Eclipsed? Do you think it should deviate even further in a different direction? Also, if you have been brewing with cards from Lorwyn Eclipsed and you would like some feedback on your deck list, or you just want to find some like-minded people to play Magic the Gathering with, then you can join my Discord server that's linked in the description. And lastly, if you are a fan of this kind of Magic the Gathering content that gets deep into deck building, mechanics, and other aspects of the game, then subscribe to the channel to see more. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.